Okay, so I think I'm introducing myself today, which is really kind of fun. And I was trying to think up some sort of Vonnegutian introduction, like, Ginger Strand is the winner of the National Book Award in the future. But I'll just be more straight. I'm the author of 4 books. The most recent one I'm here to talk to you about, The Brothers Vonnegut, Science and Fiction in the House of Magic. My previous 2 books are also narrative nonfiction. One is about interstate highways and serial killers, and the one before that is The Untold History of Niagara Falls. And an interesting thing, if you're purchasing the book today, is that the first printing of this edition screwed up the subtitles of the last 2 books. So there's a sort of printing error that maybe one day after I've won the National Book Award will be super, super valuable. But yeah, my last book was not Killer on the Road, Beauty, Power, and Lies. But that could be kind of a fun title. What I'm going to do today is talk through basically the first half of the book, The Brothers Vonnegut. I think it's more fun just to talk as opposed to hearing writers read. Given that I'm talking at Google, I actually added to the normal book talk that I usually do about this book. I put in some of the stuff about the dawn of the digital age that I have taken out in previous versions because I was thinking there might be some fans of early computers and things like that in the audience. So I just took that opportunity because I kind of geeked out myself when I was writing the book on that topic. So I have this nifty little thing. And my first slide is a picture of the Catskills. And the reason is because people always want to know when you give a book talk, why did you write this book? Like, how did you come to this story? And most people assume that since I wrote a book about Kurt Vonnegut and his older brother Bernard, that I was a big Vonnegut fan. And I actually, I really liked a couple of Vonnegut novels, but I had not read everything. When I started working on this book. I came to this book because I was reading a history of New York City's hydro infrastructure. I'm a huge fan of hydro infrastructure, and I hope some of you are too. I think it's a glorious thing. And New York City's hydro infrastructure is especially exciting. And so I was reading about this obscure episode that nobody seems to know about in 1950, where New York City had not yet completed the last of its reservoirs up in the Catskills. They had been halted first by lawsuits from New Jersey and Pennsylvania who were upset at us for taking their water. And then there was the war, the Second World War. And so in 1949, there was a big drought. By 1950, New York City was running out of water. And the New York Times was actually publishing on the front page, a little thing every day that said, "Days until water pressure runs out." Like, the water was going to stop coming out of the taps. And it was really fascinating. There were like shaveless Fridays and thirsty Thursdays where you were supposed to avoid drinking water. The mayor stopped shaving and grew a beard. Volunteers were going door to door, banging on the door, like, "Can we look at your plumbing to see if you have leaks?" People were putting little plastic swimming pools on their roofs to collect water. So it was really serious. The city was going to run out of water. And so they decided to cloud seed the Catskill Mountains and make rain for the reservoirs. So they started cloud seeding the Catskill Mountains in early 1950. They cloud seeded all through the summer. It rained all summer long. The people in the Catskills were really annoyed. They're always annoyed at us, but they were really annoyed this time. And then they continued seeding, the city continued seeding in the fall, and in Thanksgiving 1950, there was a huge storm system that went through the Northeast, and the floods in the Catskills were devastating. So New York City was slapped with a couple $1 million worth of lawsuits, and the enthusiasm for municipal rainmaking kind of evaporated. And I just was fascinated by that whole episode, and then I found out that the person who invented the method and actually advised New York City on this program was Bernard Vonnegut, the older brother of Kurt Vonnegut. And knowing what I knew about Kurt Vonnegut, that he nearly died in a slaughterhouse basement in the firebombing of Dresden, I was struck by this beautiful juxtaposition of one brother trying to bring down rain from the sky, and the other brother hiding in a slaughterhouse basement while fire is raining down on him. And I just thought, that would be a really nice essay. And hence, I wrote a book. Because the more I looked into it, the better the story got. There were all these other cool juxtapositions too. Bernard was 8 years older than Kurt, and they were kind of like opposites. They were at the two ends of the family. They had a sister in between. And Bernard was this brilliant science guy who went to MIT and got a PhD in chemistry. He was the big family success story. He was the one everyone expected to do something great, the A student, the hard worker. Kurt was kind of like the class clown, the family screw up. He'd gone to Cornell, majored in biochemistry because that's what his brother told him he should do, and he'd kind of flunked out and then joined the army. That's how he ended up in Dresden. So I really liked this sibling rivalry that they had and this kind of opposition that they had between the two of them. And then I kept discovering all these kind of groovy, coincidences in a way. So one thing that I discovered, and I would say this was the point at which I realized that I was writing a book, was that on February 14th, 1945, Bernard Vonnegut was in Minneapolis at a place called the Ice Research Base, which just the idea that there was an ice research base is pretty excellent in my opinion. But Bernard had been recruited. He was doing secret war work for the Chemical Warfare Service, and his research at the time was studying aircraft de-icing. And of course, icing has been a problem for aviation since airplanes first got up in the air. And it continues to be a problem, right? The icing of the pitot tube is what brought down that Air France airliner a few years back. The military was trying to figure out how to de-ice their bomber planes because they were flying over Europe and getting iced over, and it really was screwing things up. So Bernard was actually in a bomber in Minneapolis studying ways of mitigating the ice in order to keep the bomber planes in the air on the very day that Kurt, of course, February 14, 1945, was in the slaughterhouse basement in Dresden. When he came up 2 days later, this is what Dresden looked like. This, I think, was just, that was too compelling for me. I had to follow up. On that, the reason that I knew that Bernard was in Minneapolis on the day that the firebombing of Dresden occurred was because he wrote a letter that day on the hotel stationery from the King Cole Hotel, and he sent it to GE Labs in Schenectady. Basically, he was accepting a job offer. As part of his de-icing research, he'd started to work with some GE scientists who were also studying icing, Irving Langmuir and Vincent Schaefer at GE. So as soon as the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Bernard finished up his military reports, filed them, and became a civilian again, went to Schenectady to work at General Electric. This is General Electric today. It's still there, downtown Schenectady, the big GE monogram glowing over Erie Boulevard. I just kind of threw that in because I like this picture, and I do spend a lot of time when I'm researching a book just randomly driving around and taking photographs, so I try to use them because it makes me feel like it was a useful thing to do. So those of you who haven't heard of the GE Labs, you've probably heard of Bell Labs. Bell Labs, was one of these pioneering industrial research laboratories. GE Labs, the GE Research Lab, was there first, in fact. They were an incredible organization begun in the early 20th century by Charles Proteus Steinmetz. And the GE Lab was kind of unique among industrial research laboratories in that the scientists were allowed to pursue the research that just interested them. They were expected to spend some time working on making GE's light bulbs better and stuff like that, but they also were allowed to just follow their passions. They had something sort of googly, right? They were kind of like 20% time or something. They were given the freedom to pursue their own researches, and those things often did lead to new inventions for GE. This is the hallway in the GE research lab in about 1950. The character, the first guy on the left there is Vincent Schaefer, and the next guy down, kind of impishly peeking out of his office, is Bernard Vonnegut. Bernard had a personality quite similar to Kurt. He looks like his brother, but he also was kind of he had a great sense of humor and a sense of fun and jokes that was fun to see, even in his lab notebooks and things, as I was researching the book. So Bernard goes off, after the war, Bernard goes off to work at the GE Research Lab. So it's still looking like they're going to follow these trajectories that they're in from the start. The older brother, who's the A student and the brilliant scientist, and the younger brother, who's kind of flailing around. Kurt came back from Dresden from his time as a POW, and he really didn't know what he wanted to do with himself. All he knew for sure was that he wanted to marry Jane Cox, his childhood sweetheart, pretty much. And so they quickly got married when he got back from the war. This is shortly before their marriage, this photograph, I think, but it's kind of a great picture. And then there's this great series of letters, because Kurt was still in the Army and was sent out to, right after their wedding, was sent out to Fort Riley in Kansas. And he and Jane wrote back and forth hundreds of letters that are still in the family's possession. And they kind of show this really interesting process by which Jane convinced Kurt to become a writer. Kurt kept saying, you know, I don't know, I like writing, but really I should have an office job. Maybe I should go to law school. Maybe I should study something else. Maybe, you know, I could probably be good in human relations. You know, why don't I become a labor relations guy? You know, why don't we open a, I like this idea. For a while he was into, let's open a library/bar. He thought that would be really cool, which he probably would. And Jane just kept saying, no, you're a really good writer. You should write, and you should make it your goal to write for a living. And he would be like, you know, don't say that. It's really scary when you say that, because I could never do that. And she slowly but surely convinced him to start taking himself seriously as a writer. So one of the things he started doing while he was at Fort Riley in Kansas, oh, this is one of the letters, which you won't, the letters are so charming. And he would draw these little drawings on them. And another funny thing is that he was constantly talking about how they would have 7 kids. And he knew from the time that they were 15 that they were going to get married and have 7 kids. And if you know Kurt Vonnegut's biography, they did end up having 7 kids after Kurt and Jane had 3, and his sister died and they adopted her 4. So that's just kind of spooky. Like, he really kind of was time traveling at some point. This letter was published in the New Yorker page turner, an article I wrote. So you can, if you are interested in reading it or having it, it's on that, newyorker.com. Kurt started writing short stories while he was at Fort Riley and sending them to Jane. Jane would edit them and retype them up and mail them to editors at magazines. And I just like this. It's just a fun little detail. He didn't have paper, so he would type them on the back of the weather reports that would roll off the teletype. The story that's typed on the back of this weather report is called Atrocity Story, and it's about a guy who steals a jar of string beans while a POW in Dresden and gets executed for it. So if you've read Slaughterhouse-Five, you know that that's kind of the dark heart of Slaughterhouse-Five, the execution of Edgar Derby for stealing. Kurt eventually makes it a Dresden teapot, which is even more absurd. But this was based on a real incident that had happened to him as a POW. He was forced to be one of the people attending this execution and bury the guy afterwards. And he wrote this probably almost 10 times in 10 different ways before it became part of Slaughterhouse-Five. So Kurt finishes, gets sent home, released from the Army, and decides to go to University of Chicago and study anthropology. Still kind of not sure he's still convincing, telling Jane he's got to have a day job. He's got to have some kind of day job because 7 kids, it's a lot to support. Meanwhile, Bernard gets involved in something very interesting at the GE lab. Vincent Schaefer and Irving Langmuir. Irving Langmuir is perhaps the most famous scientist you may never have. Has anyone heard of Irving Langmuir? This would be an audience where people have, but yeah, not so many. He's a Nobel laureate chemist who worked for GE Labs, and he was a household name at this time. He and his assistant, Vincent Schaefer, had decided they'd become very interested in icing and specifically in cloud behavior during the war. And after the war, they decided, you know, why don't we see if we can figure out why it is that supercooled clouds that are, you know, cooled below the temperature of freezing, hang on to their moisture. Often the water stays liquid. It doesn't crystallize and fall as snow. So maybe we could figure out why that happens and see if we can affect it. So they were experimentalists. They decided, well, let's just try some stuff, you know. So they got in a freezer, which was easy to get because they worked at GE, and they they lined it with black velvet, and they put a light on it, and they breathed into it, which made a cloud, and then they just started like spraying stuff on this cloud to see if any of it would cause the cloud to nucleate. They had this theory that the reason supercooled clouds produce rain eventually is because something is introduced into the cloud that provides a nucleus for each little water droplet. The water droplets cling to this, and that makes them heavy enough to fall as rain. It was kind of, I don't know, it was just kind of an intuitive sense that they had watching clouds. So they start trying stuff, and they're spraying different chemicals on the cloud, and it's going on and on for a couple of months. And then one day in July, it's really, really hot in the GE offices, and Vincent's having a hard time keeping the freezer cold enough, so he throws some dry ice into the freezer, and immediately the cloud turns into a little miniature snowstorm. It's all these little snowflakes. And he goes, wow, dry ice did it, you know. So, you can repeat this experiment at home. I did it while I was working on the book. When someone sent me some steaks, you know, those steaks that come with dry ice, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna make some snow in my freezer, and then it actually worked, which was pretty neat. So Bernard got involved. They brought Bernard in, and Bernard very quickly discovered that he went through the crystallography handbook and looked at all the crystalline structures of different chemicals and found the one that was closest to water, and that was silver iodide. So he tried that on the little cloud in the little freezer, and that did the same thing. That actually caused the cloud to precipitate. So then they were really excited. They could not wait to go try this in the actual atmosphere. And they went out in November of 1946, and they sprayed some clouds with dry ice. And sure enough, it carved. This is a pattern that the airplane, you know, carved in the cloud by dropping dry ice. So GE issues a press release. You know, our GE scientists have learned to make snow and rain. And basically, the world reacts like this. World weather control. We're on the brink of world weather control. We've got it. We've solved it. We're finally doing something about the weather. And I mean, literally every newspaper, but the Boston Globe had like a 2-inch headline, "Snowstorm manufactured." Everyone was, and you know, it kind of seems silly now, but looking back at it, you know, the scientists had just harnessed the most fundamental force in the universe, right? They had just figured out how to make an atomic bomb. Nobody even knew that research was going on, and then suddenly they did it. So it just seemed like, yeah, you know, science is gonna just go wild now. So the GE was inundated, not only with clippings, but with letters. And the letters still exist in the GE archive, and they're hilarious because everybody wrote to GE, and they were like, so, we're doing a film shoot in Buffalo on December 6th, and we really would like it to snow because that's important. Or, you know, we have a ski slope in Vermont, and we would really encourage you to come here and practice your experiments. The nation of Chile wrote, and we're like, could you fix our deserts? Could you guys send some scientists down here to fix our deserts? And there were even more there were moments where there would be like forest fires, and people would call GE quick, we've got some dry ice and an airplane, and we're going to go up, tell us how to seed the clouds. And the scientists would try to talk them through it. There was a plane crash on Mount Rainier, and the military plane, and the military called GE and said, we want to clear the clouds away so we can find this airplane that crashed. And the GE scientists tried to give them advice. So it was tremendous. Bernard, at this point, is famous. He's appearing in advertisements. His career is in overdrive. He's collecting patents for various tools to do this, and they're preparing to completely manage the climate. Around about this time, Kurt Vonnegut's first son is born. He's still a student at the University of Chicago, but the first of the 7 kids is here. He's got anxiety about supporting his family. It was always really, really important to Kurt to support his family. So he starts looking for a job. And lo and behold, somebody from GE calls him and says, you know what, your brother said that you would be really a good person in our publicity department. Maybe you could come work for us. And the job was really good. It was like too good an offer to pass up. The GE, because Kurt Vonnegut always wanted to be a newspaper man. He had worked at his college newspaper, his high school newspaper. While he was at the University of Chicago, he worked in the City News Bureau. He was really comfortable in a newsroom. But a real newsroom is not really a great job. Being a real reporter is not a great job for a family man. This was kind of like a happy medium because the GE News Bureau was organized like a newsroom, except, of course, they weren't objective. But they had reporters, they had beat reporters whose, your beat would be like lighting and refrigeration. And you would go out and, find stories and report on them. And you would write up the stories with pictures and quotes and everything, and then put them in an envelope and send them to editors all over the nation. And newspaper and magazine editors appreciated this. It was free content. And so GE was really successful at this. They are the nation's biggest corporate publisher. They were at the time. And they were also incredibly successful in placing news stories. So Kurt had a science background, he had a newsroom background, and he had a need for a safe, comfortable job. So he took the job at GE and he came to work. He bought the house next door to his brothers and moved to Schenectady with his wife and son. The first thing they did was they went appliance shopping because you got an employee discount at GE. He writes his dad, he's like, yeah, we got a fridge and we got a washing machine, and it's really cute. So he starts being a good company man, going to work every day, wearing a 3-piece suit and a fedora. And this is the GE newsroom. Kurt's not in this picture, but Bernard is, because of course, those are press photographs pinned to the wall back there, and about half of them are about Bernard's project. It was GE's biggest PR success. This is Kurt at the time. This is Kurt Vonnegut at the time of this job in front of his house. And it's not the Kurt Vonnegut that we think of. When we think of Vonnegut, we think of this kind of rumpled, ironic, sarcastic, chain-smoking guy. The chain-smoking, yes, he was definitely already chain-smoking, but he was really trying to be a good company man. He was trying to, to toe the corporate line, to show the right level of team spirit, and not actually talk about the fact that secretly at night and on weekends, he was still writing short stories. All he was getting was a series of rejections, one after the other. He was writing story after story that he thought would appeal to the slick magazines. He and Jane would study the magazines, try to figure out what the editors liked. He'd produce stories, and the editors just rejected them. This went on for years. And the Lilly Library that has Kurt's papers has a file called rejection letters, which is just, for a writer, is just so affirming to go through, because it's one rejection after the other after the other. It goes on and on and on. And every now and then there'd be like a good rejection, like, well, we kind of liked this, but no. And from all the big magazines. I didn't have the foresight when I was at the Lilly Library to photograph the rejections. So these are actually my rejections that I put in the slideshow. And I'm very proud to say that they're from some of the same prestigious magazines that rejected Kurt Vonnegut. Meanwhile, Bernie, and this is kind of how the book works, it goes back and forth with these two narratives that are kind of apart and then they come together at a certain point. Bernie's project takes an interesting turn because GE is thinking, this is really kind of not a great thing. Our scientists are out there making it snow or rain or God knows what. We could actually get sued, you know, and the lawyers were just totally beside themselves. They were apoplectic about all of this. So GE decides, let's bring in the government. And in fact, the arm of the government that's most interested in weather control is the military. The GE scientists are thinking, hey, we're going to make it rain in the desert. If we can control the weather, we can stop hurricanes from hitting the shore. We can, you know, stop hailstorms that damage crops. We can do all kinds of great stuff. The admirals and the generals are thinking, if we can control the weather, you know, we could really screw with Russia. So here they are, and I love the expression on these guys' faces as they're looking into this fridge. They came for the little demonstration, and Bernard in the background there is using a child's toy, a pop gun, to precipitate the cloud because he'd figured out that that works as well. And this is a press photo that GE took to announce that they were handing this program over to the military, that their scientists were no longer actually conducting experiments, that all of the experiments were being conducted by the military, specifically the Army Corps, the Army Signal Engineer Corps. And it would be done on military planes with military pilots. And so GE was sort of insulated from lawsuits by this wall of military brass, which made them very happy. It was kind of a win for Project Cirrus, as they gave the name, you know, because you can't have a weather control project without a kind of sci-fi super, you know, name, super secret sci-fi name. So they gave it the name Project Cirrus, and they got military planes and pilots. And here they are loading a B-17 bomber plane with dry ice to go on a seeding run. Here's Vincent Schaefer installing into the B-17 a cloud droplet meter that Bernie had invented to kind of measure the number of droplets in the clouds as they're flying through them. And here's Bernie. I love this picture, sort of Bernard Vonnegut as Dr. Strangelove meets Flash Gordon, you know, on the plane, getting ready to go up there and bombard some clouds. Because, of course, the GE scientists were totally out there doing the experiments, but officially they were just consultants. So the first thing that and this must have been weird for Bernard too, right? Because now he's on the same planes that were raining down death on his brother, trying to accomplish something, he hopes, for the good of humanity. The first thing they decide to do now that they have all this new military hardware is something they'd been hoping they could do from the start, which is cloud seed a hurricane. The idea was, you know, if you could attack a hurricane, you could maybe steer it. A hurricane contains more energy than a thermonuclear bomb, so you're not going to ever control it, but you could possibly like divert it so that it would go away from land instead of towards land. So they spend the whole hurricane season of 1947 waiting for the right hurricane, like we need a hurricane that we can go, and finally one comes through, and they jump on planes, and they fly down to the military base in Florida. And the hurricane has come up through the Gulf, it's crossed the tip of Florida, and it's chugging out to sea in a northeasterly direction. And they fly out there, and they seed it, they cloud seed it. And the point at which they cloud seed it is the point at which it makes that dogleg turn left. And it comes back to shore. It just turns around, comes back to shore, slams into Savannah, hits Charleston, destroys a whole bunch of planes at the airport, millions of dollars worth of property damage, a guy's killed by a falling tree. It's a disaster. It's a total disaster. And everyone down there is furious because it's been reported that Project Cirrus is coming down to see if they can steer a hurricane. The mayor of Savannah says if anybody from GE shows up in Savannah, he's going to throw them in jail. You know, another journalist says it's a low Yankee trick, which, of course, like they're still fighting the Civil War, right? So GE gets all the scientists on the plane, flies them back to Schenectady, pushes them out in a press talk, and they're like, no, we did not see, no, we didn't see the hurricane. We were just looking at the hurricane. We really, you know, nope, nope. They just deny. And so that's kind of, you know, an interesting moment, I think, for Bernie, because suddenly it becomes clear that even if your goal is not to make a weapon, you might make one by mistake, because the atmosphere is really unpredictable. On the other hand, the entire world is really excited about the fact that weather is going to be our next big super weapon. And people are going around saying, this is more important than the atomic bomb. And I love this cover of Collier's. This is the kind of thing that everyone's envisioning. We're just going to be at our control panel here, and this is written by a military man. You know, this is how we're going to dominate the world. This is about the time that Kurt Vonnegut decides to write a new kind of story, a kind of story that features a scientist, and the scientist is kind of faced with an ethical dilemma, and that is he's invented something new and cool, but it could go wrong. It could get out of his hands. It could do something really, or it could be co-opted to be used as a weapon. He writes a story called Report on the Barnhouse Effect, in which a scientist discovers that he can control something that was previously thought to be undiscoverable. He hopes to use his power for humanity's good, and the military gets involved and wants to use it as a super weapon. They take over, they give it a sci-fi-like code name, they call it Project Wishing Well, and they start trying to conduct experiments to figure out how to weaponize it. And Professor Barnhouse has to figure out what to do. This is Kurt Vonnegut's first published story. He finally gets it right? He finally cracks the code. And in the meantime, starts developing the voice that we think of as Kurt Vonnegut, and the science fictional strategy that we think of as particularly Vonnegut's. And it's not really science fiction of the old science fiction type with like set in alien worlds and space wars and stuff. All he does is he takes the things that he's seeing at GE, and particularly the dilemmas that he's seeing his brother go through, and amps them up a little in order to kind of surface their ethical issues. For instance, GE is the first corporation that owned a differential analyzer, as they called it then, a very early computer. It was a room-sized, extremely noisy computer that the programmers, however, dressed very well, as you can see, to work on it. This computer was called OMIBAC, which is ordinal memory inspection, binary inspection computer, or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but all the computers at this time, had names like this: ENIAC, EDVAC. So OMIBAC is GE's computer. Kurt writes a story about a computer called EPICAC, and this also sells as a successful story, that falls in love with its programmer's object of affection and is cranking out, in this illustration from the story, is cranking out love poetry for her. EPICAC then goes on to become the name of the computer in Player Piano that controls everything. So Kurt writes a story, and this story is actually in the GE House magazine, written by Kurt Vonnegut but unsigned, about ultrasonics. GE was just starting to enter into research into ultrasonics, and Kurt did the press release and story about it. And then, around about the same time, he writes a short story called The UFO Question, in which there's a radio wave invented that's really this great sounding radio wave, and when people hear it, they just drop whatever they're doing and they lie around and bliss out listening to this radio wave. And so it's this huge disrupting force. So again, he's like saying, well, there's this new technology, but what if? You know, how might it go wrong? There's another story called Thanosphere about a scientist who is working for the military, helping them put a manned satellite in space. Its job is to keep tabs on the weather, but what the man inside the satellite finds out is that space is actually full of the dead. There are all these voices of the dead up there that want to be heard. The military men can't let this out because they don't want to admit that they have a satellite, because the Russians might not like that. So they actually bring it down and kill the guy. The scientist in this story is named Bernard. So this was really fun for me. As you can imagine, I totally geeked out and spent a few months knocking around in the GE archive and discovering many of the source material sources for the early Vonnegut short stories. So when I gave this talk at Vonnegut Fest, it was sort of like a, identify this story, right? Because there was the time that a deer gets into the factory at GE and has to be removed, and the GE News Bureau is called over to report on it. This, of course, becomes the first story that Kurt sold to Esquire, called Deer in the Works. There's the GE Salesforce refrigerator that walks and talks and travels around. There's a salesman who travels around with it, and it's just a little PR stunt. Kurt, and here he's starting to get really clever. He turns it into a female, right? Which then makes it into kind of a sexy sex bot. And the salesman who travels with it loses his ability to relate to real women because he's so in love with his fridge. It's like an early, version of Scarlett Johansson as an operating system. This poor guy is an air conditioning engineer who really loved model trains, and Kurt reports on his model train hobby, and then he writes a story called With His Hand on the Throttle about a guy who's so obsessed with model trains that he ignores his wife. And this is Liaquat Ali Khan, the first prime minister of Pakistan, who comes to the United States in 1950 and is given a state tour. He's trotted all around the country. He's taken to see an average American family in Kansas City. He's taken to see the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. He meets the president. He meets General Eisenhower, who's then president of Columbia University. He goes to see farms and factories and prize cattle, and eventually, of course, washes up on the shores of GE, where they take him to see, a worker driving rivets into an enormous flywheel. Liaquat Ali Khan is assassinated 1 year later. No one's ever really figured out who did it, but the point at which Liaquat Ali Khan is assassinated is the point at which Kurt decides to write The Shah of Bratpur into Player Piano. And the Shah of Bratpur is given the same exact state tour that Liaquat Ali Khan was given when he came in 1950. And then, of course, there was GE's corporate retreat center on Association Island, where you arrived and you were issued your GE t-shirt and your straw boater. I'm not sure what the boater was about, but you had to have your boater. And this, of course, every year, the promising young men of GE would be taken to Association Island for an orgy of team building and corporate pep rallies. This is, of course, the Meadows, the source for the Meadows in Player Piano, which is just almost a word-for-word transcription of what it was like to be at Association Island. It was so mercilessly skewered in Player Piano that GE closed Association Island a few years later, and Kurt Vonnegut in later life took total credit for that. He was like, yep, one good thing came out of my writing at GE. I got them to shut down that stupid island. But the most famous thing that came out of his time at GE was Ice 9. Ice 9, of course, is the premise of Cat's Cradle, his breakthrough book, published in 1963. And Kurt always told the story about how Ice 9 was actually Irving Langmuir's idea. This is Irving Langmuir, who was Time's Man of the Week for his weather projects. Ice 9 was an idea that Irving Langmuir came up with to entertain H.G. Wells. When H.G. Wells was touring the GE factory in the 1930s, he was given Langmuir as his guide, and Langmuir said he figured out, he thought, you know, I don't really know how to talk to a writer because I'm a scientist, so I guess when you talk to writers, you just have to give them new ideas for books. So he said, hey, H.G. Wells, I have a great idea for a book. How about a book about a form of ice that's stable and solid at room temperature, and it gets loose, and it like destroys the world? And H.G. Wells was like, nah. You know, and so this story was told. There were lots of stories told about Irving Langmuir because he was famously absent-minded. He would step in a can of paint and just pull his foot out and keep walking, you know, or there was a famous story about how a woman on the stairs fell down in front of him and he just like stepped over her and kept going. He would not recognize you if he was deep in thought. He was a classic scientist with his head in the clouds. And so he was also the source for Felix Honecker in Cat's Cradle. And this story was about Ice 9 was told around the GE cocktail circuit. Kurt heard it and thought finders keepers. But the real Ice 9 is actually Bernie's invention. This is Bernie using a hydrogen generator to light his silver iodide, because he'd found that if you aerosolize it, turn it into a smoke, it works even better to precipitate the clouds. And when Kurt asked Bernie to explain his invention, Bernie explained it. He said, well, you know, ice can, the molecules in ice, when it becomes crystalline, they can lock in different formations. Think about cannonballs on a courthouse lawn. You could stack them in different formations. And that's kind of why we have these different crystalline forms of ice. We have ice 1, ice 2, ice 3. At the time, ice, there were only 5 known crystalline forms. And so in Cat's Cradle, that's exactly how Ice 9 is explained in Bernard's exact words. So Bernard, during all of this time, is deeply concerned about the weaponization of his project, his cloud seeding project. And I threw in some slides about something else I geeked out on while I was working on this book, because there was actually a competing weather control project going on at the time. This is John von Neumann, who was one of the first 5 members of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Famous, brilliant mathematician, so smart people thought that he probably wasn't even human. Von Neumann was actually working on a weather control project that he'd had knocking around in his head since 1946. His idea was very, very different from the GE scientists. The GE scientists were experimentalists. They were empiricists. They were like, let's go out and spray the clouds with some stuff and see what happens. Von Neumann thought, you know, the weather is simply a problem of fluid dynamics. And he knew a lot about fluid dynamics. Von Neumann actually did the math that proved the implosion theory that was used on the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, that was dropped on Nagasaki. He was part of the Manhattan Project. He was already thinking about the thermonuclear bomb, which he and Edward Teller were convinced should be built before anyone else was. Von Neumann wanted to build a computer. He wanted to build a super fast computer because he wanted it to do the calculations for the thermonuclear bomb, and there was no computer with enough computing power yet to do it, but he thought he had an architecture that would work. He needed, however, a public thing for the computer to work on. He needed a public reason for this computer to happen. So he approached the Weather Bureau. He said, I've got this great idea. We could use the computer to forecast the weather. Because the weather is a deterministic system, and once we've got enough data and enough computing power, we will be able, and obviously I'm shortcutting a lot here, but we'll be able to predict the weather infinitely. And once we can do that, we will be able to control the weather, because it will surely have instabilities in the system. Freeman Dyson was a young physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study at the same time. He heard von Neumann give a talk at the time, and he kind of summarized it as, all stable systems we shall predict, all unstable systems we shall control. So Von Neumann gets together two groups of people. The first is a group of meteorologists. These are the meteorologists who are going to produce the math, because of course the math for modeling the weather didn't yet exist. So they had to get together the best and the brightest of meteorologists to come up with the equations that they would feed to the computer. The first round of equations were fed actually to ENIAC because John von Neumann's computer wasn't done yet. And when I was looking at the logbooks, I just thought this was amusing. The ENIAC, this is why John von Neumann wanted to build a new computer. It's like ENIAC, 1405, ENIAC down, 1415, still no ENIAC. You know, it was so hard working with this computer. So in 1952, von Neumann's computer is finished. This thing is a Ferrari, you know, in a land that has only seen horse and carriages so far. I mean, this was this is what's called the IIS machine. It actually is now at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And those things along the bottom are Williams cathode ray tubes. That's the memory. There were 40 of those, adding up to a total of 5 kilobytes of memory, 5 whole kilobytes. This was a supercomputer. It was beautiful, and it was so compact. It only weighed, you know, a couple tons. It was 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. It's a beauty. Von Neumann was very proud of it, and he fed his equations into it and began predicting weather. However, he was best friends with another guy, Norbert Wiener, a mathematician at MIT, who thought, you know what? You're never going to be able to predict the weather infinitely, because the weather is really unstable, and it's just got all these tiny little instabilities in it that are going to magnify at great speed. So you might be able to predict the weather for, Wiener thought 30 days. It turns out it's 2 weeks, right? We can predict the weather with some, you know, accuracy for 2 weeks out, and then it just all goes to hell. It's a funny thing. Wiener and John von Neumann were best friends. They were very, very different. Wiener was a famous pacifist who, after the war, famously refused to share his research work with anyone in the military or defense contractors at all, and he wrote famous articles about this. Von Neumann, of course, was the military's right-hand man. One person who really agreed with Wiener, who thought that he was kind of a hero, was Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut read Wiener's book, Cybernetics. Cybernetics is a book that kind of nobody reads anymore because its conclusions are so much now part of our DNA that we don't even have to think about it or talk about it. But he basically was one of the first people to say, look, the brain is a kind of computer and a computer is a kind of brain. And Wiener also wanted to think about the moral issues of this. If, you know, computers start doing if machines are doing our physical labor and computers begin doing our mental labor, what kind of world will we have? What will happen to humanity? What kind of people will we turn into? He was thinking hard about these things in cybernetics, and then he was encouraged to write a book, a version of it without the math that was called The Human Use of Human Beings. Kurt was a big fan of Wiener and of cybernetics, and when he wrote Player Piano, he actually quotes Wiener at a couple points in Player Piano. He sent the book to Norbert Wiener, thinking that Wiener would love it, because Kurt was basically saying, in a fictional form, exactly what Wiener was saying in his own work. Much to his chagrin, Wiener hated the book, and he sent him a really nasty letter that's still extant. It's at MIT in his papers, where he said, you know, you're playing around with this fiction, whatever, not very serious, you know. But the real objection that he had, and he went on and on about it, was there's a character in Player Piano who writes a manifesto, and the manifesto is basically taken from Norbert Wiener's work. It sounds exactly like Norbert Wiener, in which he's saying human beings need to think of themselves as human beings. They need to consistently remind themselves that they're human beings, and not let technology take their essential humanity away from them. Kurt Vonnegut named that character Ludwig von Neumann. Yeah, which I have to think was done ironically. because von Neumann was very excited about self-replicating automata. He wrote a famous paper about it. In any case, Wiener was a skeptic not only about Kurt Vonnegut, but about weather control. He really thought that weather control was not going to happen, the system was too unstable, and even weather prediction was going to be hard. Bernard Vonnegut is starting to think the same thing, and one of the reasons he's starting to think that is because as soon as weather control became a thing, people were making the pilgrimage nonstop to GE to find out how to seed clouds. And so New York City is seeding the Catskills to fill their reservoirs. People in the Great Plains are seeding the clouds to try to steer away hailstorms. This is some people from New Mexico who came to, they were of course having a drought because they live in New Mexico. They were coming to check out, thinking that they could seed the clouds and fix New Mexico. Bernard is starting to think, well, we're stinking up the whole atmosphere of the nation with silver iodide. What could we actually be doing? What might be happening out there? This is a map that he made in 1951 showing the areas in the United States that were under cloud seeding contracts. So this is where people were going out spraying massive amounts of silver iodide because nobody knew how much or how little you could use. They were just going out. There was one congressman who would go out with dry ice, like in a yogurt container, and used a teacup to throw it out the window of a Cessna. And then if it rained, he would land and jump out of the plane and go up to the ranchers and be like, I just made you that rain. There were astonishing things going on, and Bernard was really interested in finding out what was actually happening. He thought that their work and that the work of all these amateurs might in fact be changing the atmospheric dynamics of North America. And he started saying this, and people of course said to him, well, don't be ridiculous. Nothing that humans do could change the atmospheric dynamics. I mean, that's the whole climate we're talking about, right? So I'm going to leave you there. I hope I have time if there are questions. That's pretty much an outline of the first half of the book. What happens in the second half is Kurt continues to write short stories and writes player piano about what he's seeing at GE, and Bernard becomes more and more convinced that he has to do something, and he kind of figures out what, in part through his conversations and relationship with his brother. So I'm just curious to know how many people in the room are Vonnegut fans. Interesting. So Vonnegut fans who've read more than 2 of the books. All of the books? Anybody? How many? I don't even know the answer to that. There are a lot. I was talking to someone who was a fan of the short stories, which is, I think, the Vonnegut that most people don't read, but the short stories are pretty fun. So.
I had a question. Was there a tension between Bernard and Kurt? Because here's Bernard working as this corporate scientist, and then at some point, these stories start coming out, and they're kind of goofing on the whole sort of military-industrial complex. Did Bernard ever feel any sort of pressure or tension that he's got this corporate job as an in-house scientist, and yet his brother, who's at some point also employed by GE, is writing these stories that are kind of mocking the whole thing?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of, I think, tension felt on both of their parts in a way, because Bernard agreed with Kurt, but he loved his job, and he loved working at GE, but at the risk of giving you spoilers, he does quit eventually, and it's partly because of exactly the same things that drove Kurt to quit, not wanting to be part of that corporate world and not wanting to be told that he had to work with the military, that he had to do whatever the corporation wanted him to do. So I would say that most of the anxiety was on Kurt's part, and there's a very funny letter that Kurt wrote to his editor when Player Piano was about to come out, which is the dark night of the soul that you always have when your first book comes out as a writer. You're like, holy crap, what have I done? Like, people are gonna read this and I've exposed myself or my whatever, And so he writes this holy crap letter to his editor, and he says, you could never tell anybody that I worked for GE because GE has a hostage, my brother. So anyway, thanks so much for coming.